Thankfully, the nuclear bomb has only been used twice, both times by the USA on Japan to end the Second World War. Together, the two bombs killed about 200,000 people, the majority of them civilians. Ever since, there has been debate over whether it was the right thing to do. Could America have done something else? What other options did it have? Surely the deliberate targeting of civilians can never be justified. For some, the use of the bombs was necessary to bring an end to the worst war in human history. For others, it was a war crime, an example of America behaving as inhumanely as the evil enemy that they were fighting. In this video, I'm going to try to persuade you that, given their options, the Americans were right to use nuclear weapons on Japan. They really had no choice. It was, of course, a disaster that it had to be done, but it was the least bad of a set of very bad options. However, before we go into that, let's have a quick overview of the history to try to understand the position the USA was in 1945. In the West, we think of World War II as starting in 1939, but in Asia it actually started 2 years earlier than that, in 1937. Initially, it was a war between China and Japan. China had been engulfed in a decade-long civil war, leaving it completely unable to resist when Japan invaded. Very quickly, the Japanese occupied a huge part of China, including the major cities. The USA was alarmed by the Japanese expansionism and decided to take economic measures. In the summer of 1941, it froze Japanese assets and put in place an oil embargo. That embargo was a major threat to the Japanese war effort. Without oil, they wouldn't be able to maintain their war against China. The solution of the Japanese was to try to destroy the US Navy to give them total dominance over the Pacific Ocean. Their plan was to launch a surprise attack at the US naval base at Pearl Harbor. That happened on December the 7th, 1941, and it was a stunning success for the Japanese. They sunk or damaged 8 battleships and killed over 2,000 sailors. Over the next few weeks, the Japanese built on that success. They took a huge amount of territory in Asia, including Vietnam, Indonesia, Burma, and the Philippines. It appeared that the Japanese had given themselves a decisive advantage. They had dealt the USA a terrible blow and controlled an absolutely enormous empire in Asia. However, the price they paid for that was that they were now at war with the USA, a position you never want to be in. Over the next few years, America turned the tide of the war, winning battle after battle and gradually pushing the Japanese back. By 1945, they had total dominance over the Pacific and air supremacy over mainland Japan. It was only a matter of time before victory was theirs. However, the Americans had a problem. The Japanese were fanatical opponents. They were determined to fight to the last man, even when the battle was clearly lost. That meant that they were costing the Americans a huge number of casualties. An example was the Battle of Iwo Jima, where 20,000 Japanese defended the small Pacific island against 110,000 Americans. The US did win control of the island, but at a huge cost of 7,000 dead, 20,000 injured. It was a similar story at the Battle of Okinawa. An American force of 500,000 suffered 12,000 dead and 40,000 injured. Losses that high posed an obvious question. How on earth was the USA going to take mainland Japan? If they were losing tens of thousands of men taking tiny Pacific islands, an invasion of mainland Japan could see millions of American casualties. For America, that wasn't an option. The decision was taken to use a horrifying new weapon that had just been developed, the atomic bomb. Once the Japanese saw its power, they would surely surrender, ending the war and saving the Americans from having to invade Japan. On August the 6th, 1945, the world saw the power of nuclear weapons when a bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. Within hours, roughly 70,000 people were dead. However, the Japanese still refused to surrender, and so, 3 days later, the Americans dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. Even then, the Japanese were incredibly reluctant to surrender. Eventually, a full 6 days later, the emperor took to the radio and announced that Japan would surrender. In his speech to the Japanese public, he said, The enemy has developed a new and most cruel bomb which has the power to do incalculable damage. If we continue to fight, it would lead to the obliteration of Japan and the total extinction of human civilization. On the 2nd of September, aboard the USS Missouri, the Japanese signed their surrender. World War II was finally over. So, that is what happened. The use of the atomic bomb on 2 Japanese cities. Now for the question of the video. Was their use justified? First, I want to persuade you that the Americans absolutely had to end the war as soon as possible. They were determined that the war wouldn't last a day longer than it needed to, and they were right to be. That is not just for their own sake, but more than anything for the sake of the people of Asia. For me, the most compelling reason that the war needed to be ended as soon as possible was the astonishing evil and sadism with which the Japanese treated the people of Asia. The priority wasn't just ending the war, it was ending the evil Japanese empire. There are numerous examples of the cruelty of the Japanese, many of them you probably haven't heard of. One example was their horrific human experimentation laboratories. The most famous was Unit 731, where roughly 300,000 people died. Experiments included the injection of diseases or animal blood, deliberate dehydration, or surgery without anesthesia. Limbs were amputated to see how fast the victim would die of blood loss. Some prisoners had their stomachs surgically removed and their esophagus reattached to their intestines. The victims included children and even babies. Flamethrowers were tested on live people, with the victims tied to stakes and burned alive. In other experiments, victims were placed into low-pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their sockets. Another example of the Japanese evil was the 3 alls policy that they implemented later in the war. The 3 alls referred to kill all, burn all, and loot all. Essentially, because they were finding it impossible to distinguish between civilians and soldiers, the solution of the Japanese was to kill any Chinese that they found. The Japanese also committed some horrific massacres, one of the most famous being the Nanking Massacre, one of the worst war crimes of the century. Over 6 weeks, roughly 200,000 civilians were murdered, often in the most sadistic of ways. Babies were thrown into the air and caught on the bayonets of Japanese rifles. In one infamous story, 2 Japanese soldiers had a contest to see who could be the first to kill 100 people. There was also the mass rape of Chinese women. As you can see, the Japanese were truly evil, and even more frightening was the sheer number of people that lived under them. From 1942 to 45, about 400 million people were subjects of the Japanese Empire. With so many people living under such a brutal regime, the number of deaths was truly staggering. Wikipedia puts the total number murdered by the Japanese at about 30 million. That brings us on to what I think is the clearest argument that the war needed to be ended as soon as possible, the sheer number of people that the Japanese were killing. Take China as an example. China alone lost almost 20 million civilians from the Japanese occupation. That works out at almost 50,000 people per week in the 8 years from 1937 to 45. Indonesia lost 4 million, which works out at 20,000 per week. It's hard to know exactly how many civilians the Japanese were killing in 1945, but it was probably about 250,000 per month. That means that every week that the Americans delayed the end of the war, tens of thousands of civilians were dying. Compare that with the number of people that died from the atomic bombs. The high estimates put the total number of deaths at 230,000. That is roughly equal to the number of civilians that were getting murdered by the Japanese every month in Asia. For the Americans to delay the end of the war by even a single month would lead to the same number of excess deaths as the total number that died from both atomic bombs. Delaying by, say, half a year would lead to far, far more civilian deaths, probably more than 1 million. So hopefully I've persuaded you that the Japanese needed to be defeated as soon as possible. That then raises the question, did the Americans have any other way to end the war so fast? Did they really have to use nuclear weapons on cities, or could they have done something else? That is a much more complicated and difficult question, but my view is that it was basically the only way to end the war so fast. To demonstrate that, let's go through some of the other options that the Americans had available to them and see why they wouldn't have worked. The most obvious thing that the USA could have done would have been a land invasion of Japan. For me, that idea can be dismissed fairly easily. First, it would have taken years, leading to the deaths of millions of civilians in Asia at the hands of the Japanese. The USA would probably have lost more than 500,000 troops. Japan itself would also have lost millions of civilians and soldiers. In short, we can be absolutely certain that the death toll from an American invasion of Japan would have far exceeded the death toll from using the nuclear weapons. Many other ideas are suggested for what the Americans should have done. One idea is that they could have used a naval blockade and conventional bombing to force the Japanese to surrender. That idea suffers from many of the same problems as the previous one. It would have delayed the end of the war by months. It also ignores the fact that conventional weapons can kill civilians in numbers just as high as nuclear weapons. For example, in the firebombing of Tokyo, about 100,000 civilians died. Just as many people died in Tokyo from conventional weapons as died from each atomic bomb. Conventional bombing also had the problem that there was no way of knowing if it would actually get the Japanese to surrender. It's truly astonishing just how determined the Japanese were to not surrender. In the months before the nuclear bombs, the Americans were dropping thousands of tons of conventional bombs on Japanese cities. The Japanese air defense had been totally obliterated, so the Americans were barely taking any losses. Despite that, the Japanese were determined to carry on. Their Prime Minister said that Japan could carry on fighting for at least 2 more years. I think in hindsight, it's very unlikely that the Japanese would have held out for that long, but it's an example of the kind of thing that they were saying. I should make clear that the Japanese were actually willing to come to the negotiating table, but they had numerous demands that were unacceptable to the Americans. They were determined that there would be no occupation of Japan and that they would be able to keep their empire. That is why they wanted to continue fighting. Their thinking was that the more they cost the Americans, the more they would be able to bargain for at a peace negotiation. For the Americans, the idea of Japan keeping its empire was totally unacceptable, and given that you now know the number of civilians that they were killing, I'm sure you can understand why. The Americans wanted unconditional surrender, and they weren't willing to settle for anything else. In my view, the only way for the Americans to get unconditional surrender so fast was by using nuclear weapons. That raises the question, did they really need to use them on cities? Could the Americans have bombed a purely military target or a depopulated area just to show the bomb's power? Well, those sorts of ideas were considered by the Americans, but they always found problems with them. First, they were concerned that using the bombs in a depopulated area wouldn't actually be that impressive. In the words of Oppenheimer, it would be an enormous nuclear firecracker detonated at great height, doing little damage. In short, they didn't think it would actually get the Japanese to surrender. Another issue was that the Americans didn't have an unlimited number of bombs. They only actually had 2, the 2 that they used. A third was on the way, but it wouldn't be available for several weeks. The idea also had another major problem. If the Americans were going to drop the bomb on some random field to demonstrate the power of it, they would need to tell the Japanese where they were going to drop it. If the Japanese weren't paying attention, they wouldn't see the actual blast. If they didn't see it and all they saw was the scorched field afterwards, that wouldn't be remotely impressive. It wouldn't make them realize just how powerful the bomb was. That meant that the Americans would have to tell the Japanese where they were going to drop the bomb. As you can imagine, there would be tons of issues with that. The Japanese would know where the plane was going to fly, so they could try to shoot it down or try to intercept it. If they did manage to intercept the plane, that would be a monumental disaster. The Japanese would then have the bomb that they could potentially use, or even worse, they could study it, helping them make their own bomb. Something else the Americans were worried about was that if the Japanese knew where the bomb was going to be detonated, they would move American prisoners of war there. Another worry was whether the bombs would fail to explode. That, just like the plane getting intercepted, would have been an enormous disaster, as the Japanese could have then used the bomb themselves or studied it. Now, in fairness, that was a risk wherever they dropped the bomb, whether they dropped it on a city or on some random field. The difference is, if they dropped the bomb in a field, they would be taking that risk to do something that probably wouldn't even get the Japanese to surrender. In short, the Americans really didn't want to be dropping numerous bombs on fields in Japan. Another option was to drop the bomb on a purely military target. That had a lot of the same problems as dropping the bomb on a depopulated area. It also had another issue, which was that all of the major military targets were embedded in cities. In fact, part of the reason that Hiroshima was chosen was precisely because it was a major military center and up to 20,000 soldiers did die in the blast. In my view, the bombs needed to be used on cities because they needed to have the biggest possible impact on the psychology of the Japanese government. I mean, just think for a minute about the fact that the Japanese didn't surrender after the first bomb. 100,000 people had just been killed in a single blast, and yet they still didn't surrender. Even after the second one, they did only just, and after several days. In fact, the story of what was happening in the Japanese government at the time is absolutely astonishing. There were essentially 7 major decision makers in Japan, the Emperor and a war council of 6 men. The war council was made up of the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister and 4 generals. Before the first atomic bomb, there were 2 men considering surrendering, the Emperor and the Foreign Minister. Then the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August the 6th, and what followed was really pretty crazy. The Foreign Minister went to the Emperor and told him that the war was lost and Japan had to surrender. The Emperor responded that the Foreign Minister organised a meeting with the rest of the War Council to try to persuade them. When the Foreign Minister tried to organise the meeting, 4 members of the War Council simply didn't turn up. One minister actually said that he was busy with, in his words, more pressing business. Just to emphasise the point, the nuclear bomb had just been dropped on his country, and his response was that he had more important things to do than decide whether Japan should surrender. Probably what was happening was that those men couldn't bring themselves to either advocate for surrender because they found it shameful, or advocate for continuing the war because they knew it would destroy Japan. On the next day, the 9th of August, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. That same day, something else very important happened. Russia declared war on Japan. The entrance of Russia into the war was actually a very big deal. They had been neutral up until that point, and some members of the Japanese government had even been trying to approach them to agree terms for a ceasefire with America. When the Russians declared war, it was a big psychological blow to the Japanese, as it was a major threat to their armies in Asia. The combination of the second nuclear bomb and the declaration of war by Russia was enough to persuade the Japanese that they needed to surrender. However, there were still members of the Japanese military that wanted to continue fighting. Some officers in Tokyo decided to try to seize power in a military coup. They were going to put the emperor under house arrest and continue the war. The attempted coup did go ahead on the 14th, but in the end there wasn't enough support for it. The emperor announced Japan's surrender the next day on the radio. Before wrapping up, there are a few other things that I would like to stress to help you understand the position the Americans were in. First is just how much uncertainty there was over everything. For example, Oppenheimer, the chief scientist, thought that only 20,000 people would die from the bomb. In one conversation, he actually said that it had no military significance and it would just make a big bang. The effects of radiation were also not really known. Oppenheimer and a few of his colleagues were aware, but not to the full extent of it. The military staff and the politicians had no idea about the radiation. It was only after the first bomb that the Americans truly understood the impact that the bomb had when it was dropped on a city. It's also important to remember that the Americans didn't know whether the Japanese were close to surrendering or not. We now know with hindsight that 2 of the 7 major decision makers in Japan were considering surrender even before the atomic bombs were used. More Japanese ministers would likely have been persuaded once Russia declared war and invaded. That is great for us to know now in hindsight, but for the Americans at the time, there was no way they could have known that. Something else I'd like to stress is that the Americans did take very seriously the moral considerations of what they were doing. They definitely didn't take it lightly, and in my view, they didn't have a thirst for revenge. One example of that is that the Americans didn't want to drop the bomb on the city of Kyoto. Kyoto was the historic capital of Japan. It was a city of 1 million people, and crucially, it hadn't yet been bombed in the war. Dropping the atomic bomb on Kyoto would have delivered the biggest impact to the Japanese, and it was the target most likely to make them surrender. It was precisely because Kyoto was a city of such historic and cultural value that the Americans chose not to drop the bomb there. In the words of Truman, the US should not behave like beasts just because the Japanese were behaving so. In conclusion, I believe that the Americans were right to use nuclear weapons to end World War II. That is for many reasons, but most of all because there is nothing that would have ended the war as quickly. Even if you believe that the only thing that the USA should have taken into consideration was minimizing civilian deaths, I still think that using the bomb was the right decision. I don't see any option that the Americans had that would have led to less civilian deaths. That is more than anything due to the statistic that I have repeated over and over again in the video, that the Japanese were killing roughly 250,000 Asian civilians per month. Ultimately, when you have an empire that is evil to that extent, there simply cannot be any delay in ending it.